Welcome to All Things with Jen Oshman, where we look at current events and trends through a Christian lens. All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus, so we're seeking to apply His word to what's happening here and now. This episode of All Things is brought to you by Crossway, publisher of the new book, Behold and Believe, a Bible study on the I Am statements of Jesus by Courtney Doctor and Joanna Kimbrell. Seeing is believing. If we want to know who Jesus is and why he is important to our lives, we need to take a closer look at what he said about himself. Whether you've never read the Bible, have followed Jesus for years, or find yourself somewhere in between, this 7-week Bible study from Courtney Doctor and Joanna Kimbrell explores the question, who is Jesus? Using the I am statements in the Gospel of John, readers will learn how to observe, interpret, apply, and reflect on key Bible verses about Jesus' identity. Weekly prayers, memory verses, brief commentaries, and discussion questions help women to see Jesus, trust him alone for salvation, and proclaim his goodness to others. Pick up a copy of Behold and Believe today and receive 30% off when you sign up for a free Crossway Plus account at crossway.org/plus. Well, I am super excited to bring you today's episode of All Things because it's on one of my very favorite topics, women's ministry. And Jen Wilkin is joining me. And I don't think she needs any introduction for most of you, but just in case so you know, Jen Wilkin is an author and Bible teacher from Dallas, Texas. She has organized and led studies for women in home, church, and parachurch contexts. An advocate for Bible literacy, her passion is to see others become articulate and committed followers of Christ with a clear understanding of why they believe what they believe, grounded in the Word of God. Chances are high that you've read Jen's book, Women of the Word, or you've participated in one of her excellent and many and in-depth Bible studies. Our church uses her resources frequently, and I'm so thankful for the way that she has poured into women around the world and how she's just been a champion for women to know God and to know His Word. So Jen wrote an article for Christianity Today last month, and the article is entitled, Honor Thy Church Mothers with Wages. Now, in my opinion, the article is so helpful and necessary, and it's a loving exhortation to the average American church, which does not compensate the women who lead their vital women's ministries and Bible studies. Jen cites new research from Lifeway Research, which finds that over 83% of women who serve in women's ministries across the nation do so as volunteers. So, for the vast majority, women who lead in churches are not being paid to do so. So that's what you're going to hear us talk about. Why that is, why that should not be. We cover a lot of good news and offer some loving critiques. So you're going to hear both. My hope is that women in ministry or women who attend women's ministry, and also pastors and elders and male church leaders will listen to this conversation and glean both some good news, but also some areas for growth. Also, when the episode is over, please be sure to check the show notes. I'm going to leave you with a handful of resources that I know are reputable and practical and affordable if you are a woman who wants to grow in your capacity for ministry or if you know a woman who does. All right, well, let's listen in. Welcome to All Things, everybody. Today I have with me Jen Wilkin. Jen, thanks for being on the podcast.
Oh, it's so good to be on. It's the Jen Show today.
That's right. I love that. I love that. Well, I wanted to have you on because you wrote an article last month, which was so helpful. And in it, you referenced some research that was going to come out this month, which came out last week. And basically, it's Lifeway Research. They surveyed about 1,000 female churchgoers and 843 women's ministry leaders for their State of Ministry to Women study. The statistics are super interesting. I've pored over them now for the last week, and I want to chat with you about them. But as we lay the groundwork for this, inevitably, I know that the conversation kind of has to start with the question of why should we have women's ministry in the first place?
And that's a valid question. And I do think it is the question that will be lurking in the minds of anyone who reads the statistics is like, gosh, maybe the fact that this is almost entirely unpaid work means that it's not essential to what we're doing. And I think that we have to ask ourselves what we mean when we say women's ministry before we seek to dignify the role of the person who is leading it, and which is not to say that we should be dismissive of various forms, but we do want women's ministry to be substantive. and we do want it to be well done if it's something that we're going to talk about, whether it should be a compensated role or not. And so there are, women's ministry can look a lot of different ways. And if the main focus of it is not something that is clearly tied to disciple making, if it's not something that's clearly tied to the work of fulfilling the Great Commission, then it's worth evaluating. So when we talk
Mhm.
about women's ministry in general, we do need to ask, what do we mean by that? When I
Mhm.
talk about it, what I mean is that there would be a gender specific space in which older women are able to equip younger women in ways that wouldn't happen outside of an all female space. And so that's going to have pastoral components to it. Notice I didn't say a woman is a pastor, but a pastoral component in the sense that there will be care that a woman can provide for another woman that could not be provided by a man. And there will be vulnerability that a woman will have with another woman that she might not have with a man in leadership, or maybe ought not to have with a man in leadership in terms of what she needs to share or the help that she might be seeking. So there's the care aspect of it, but then there's also the discipleship aspect of it. There is something to be said for a younger woman or a less mature woman in the faith seeing a more mature or an older woman in the faith exercising skill in understanding and communicating the Bible, or exercising skill in showing someone a better way to pray. We follow people who we perceive to be a model to us, and so we should want there to be a space in the church where female leaders are able to model something that male leaders are not going to.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate your answer for a couple of reasons. One, you say it should be substantive, and I couldn't agree more. We're not talking about, gathering for tea or social circles, though that might be
Mhm.
part of it, but
Mhm.
we're
Mhm.
seeking discipleship and
Mhm.
so that women would come to know the Lord and to grow in Him.
Mhm.
I find though, when I have conversations with those who have never been involved in women's ministry, so usually a pastor or another male
Mhm.
leader or churchgoer, there just is maybe they're not convinced that it's a useful space. Well, what
Mhm.
can she really glean that she can't get on Sunday morning or that she can't get at small group? Like they seem a little bit mystified that a female only space is somehow useful. Would you mind
Yeah.
unpacking that just a little more?
Yeah, it can often be seen as a redundancy, and I think that
Mhm.
a lot of times that perception can arise um, out of a lack of experience of actually being in the space. And so, one of the things that I will usually ask pastors to do when they begin to ask questions about the women's ministry at their church is to go spend time there, to go to the leader meetings and to go to the Bible study and see what's actually taking place, to have interactions with that leader, asking her what her vision is for the ministry and how is she building out that ministry. Because I think a lot of times the ministry is only seen at a distance, but because it's a pink space, so to speak, the pastor either feels that he would be an odd fit to show up at one of those things, or he just doesn't have any natural interest in being there. So whichever of those two it is, or somewhere in between, I would just urge him not to take maybe his wife's word for it because she's been there, even though her perspective on it might be valid, but that he should have firsthand understanding of what is actually going on in the space. And then, yeah, if what's going on in the space looks like a big redundancy to what's happening on Sunday morning, then there probably needs to be a conversation about what is unique about that space beyond just the fact that it's an all female one. But I
Mhm.
would say that that's true for every area of ministry. So, for
Yeah.
example, you don't want your student ministry to be knocking off what's happening on a Sunday morning. It should be
Mhm.
doing something that is very distinctly different from that. You don't want your children's ministry to be a substitute for what's happening on Sunday morning. I think with a home group, since home groups are by definition, well, I guess they're not always by definition, but in most cases, those are mixed gender spaces. Um, what my experience has been, and I think many women's experience has been in a home group setting, is that not only does the majority of the hospitality and childcare element fall to the women in those groups,
Mhm.
but also their ability to opt into the conversations is often limited by those other factors as well. And then
Mhm.
on top of that, a home group is good at forming community, but it's not a great place for necessarily learning things.
Mhm.
Not only
Mhm.
that, but many women are not comfortable speaking into a mixed gender discussion at a thought level because we have baggage around that sometimes in our churches.
Mhm.
Or maybe they just have baggage around it themselves. Either way, it means that the conversations that do happen in a mixed gender setting are not always as balanced as the men may perceive them to be.
Mhm.
Typically, men speak twice as often as women in a mixed setting. That's not a church statistic, that's just a sociological statistic.
Mhm.
And so, when we talk about single gender spaces, one of the most beautiful things that I think they do is they allow a woman to feel more comfortable actually speaking up and participating. And in most cases, because we've removed barriers of childcare and scheduled it at a time that works for her, it allows her to opt in at a level that she might not be able to in another space.
Mhm. Yeah, that phrase opt in, I think, is really helpful. It's true. Women's ministry, I have seen, you and I both have served in women's ministry for
Mhm.
decades at this
Mhm.
point, and I
Mhm.
have just seen such a radical transformation happen to a woman who was maybe on the periphery or
Yeah.
maybe who hasn't even come into church yet, but she's
Mhm.
invited by a friend or a colleague or a sister, and she comes and she feels seen and cared for, and like there's space for her to say something silly and wrong, a gentle place for her to learn and grow. And then
Mhm.
she opts into more of church life. She's trusts more what's going on Sunday mornings or other opportunities to serve and come alongside her new faith family.
Y
It's kind of like this gateway.
You're exactly right, and I think that's something that's often overlooked in a broader discipleship strategy, like just an adult discipleship strategy at a church or even wanting to be a hospitable place is when you're looking for where are the front doors to our church, it is surprising to me how rarely women's ministry is seen as that, but how much of a front door it truly is. We see it all the time in the Bible study that I'm a part of in my own local church.
Mhm.
It's a big deal to go visit a small group, a home group, whatever your community calls them. There's a million different names for them, and you feel like you have to go and sort of it's like a blind date and sign your life away with a group of people that you don't know very well. But a women's Bible study, by contrast, is something that you can opt into for a set period of time, and it can allow you to develop some low level relationships that then help you decide whether you might want to visit the small group of a woman who is in that setting or not. But yeah, it's a place where for a lot of for a lot of families, the person who brings the family to church, the very first person who says, "Hey, we should check this church out," is the woman, the wife or the mother. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really true. So I guess, yeah, what we're saying to whoever is listening, I mean, I think I run into a lot of women who are involved in churches that don't have a women's ministry, or there might be a male listening to this who's a leader at his church and he's recognizing they don't have a women's ministry. And I hope they'll take our word for it and maybe, as you say, go see a women's ministry for themselves. But they are just such a fruitful, special place, and
Hmm.
I'm just so thankful for the time I have spent in women's ministry. And I know that that goes for so many women that we know.
Hmm.
So that leads me into kind of the crux of why I reached out to you and said, "Hey, you want to come on the podcast and talk about this?" You and I know, and many women know, and many pastors know as well, just how deeply valuable their women's ministry are.
Hmm.
And yet, here is some data that Lifeway uncovered for us. 83% of women's ministry leaders serve as volunteers or unpaid staff.
Hmm.
Only 9% are paid part time, and only 8% are paid full time. So
Hmm.
we see right here the vast majority of women who lead in women's ministry are doing so in the margins of life as volunteers, unpaid. And that statistic even carries over to larger churches with more than 500 members. You wrote in your article that only 29% of women's ministry leaders were paid full time positions for those larger churches.
Hmm.
24% were paid part time, almost half, 46% received no pay. So it's not
Hmm.
necessarily we're a church plant or we're a small church and can't afford it, because this translates into our bigger churches as well. And I know this is a massive question, but it's going to help us get toward the crux of it. Why do you think so few women's ministry leaders are paid by their churches?
Well, first, let me just tell a little my own story related to this to help you understand why this was something I even cared to write an article on in the first place.
Great.
Back in 1996, when I was just a young pup, I was volunteering at my church. I was volunteering on the women's ministry lead team. The church was probably about 1,200 people at that point. It had grown fairly rapidly over the previous 4 or 5 years. And the woman who was leading the team had led for about 2 years. She was not paid. and she stepped down. She was the third leader that I had served under at that point in the short time that I had been on the women's ministry team. And that is because it was too much work for a volunteer. Because we kept churning through leaders for the team, the ministry wasn't gaining the momentum that it could. It was like a reset with a new leader every year
Mhm.
to 2 years in. There was no formal budget for the ministry. Anytime that we wanted to plan something, we had to raise our hand and ask for money to be allocated for what we wanted to do. So I wrote an email to the executive pastor of the church and I said, would you consider hiring someone part time into this role just so that there can be stability in the ministry? Because this is, obviously a meaningful part of the church. That was recognized that it was a meaningful part of the church, but um, we weren't placing our money where our mouth was. And so even though I'm a huge believer in volunteer service and have myself served as a volunteer in women's ministry for most of the time that I've been involved in it, uh, there is something to be said for looking at that women's ministry role the same way that we would look at another role in the church with comparable influence on the spiritual formation of, well, in this case, over half of the adult attendees in the church. So I wrote this email, and the executive pastor invited me to come meet with him, and he said, "Gosh, I agree with you. And would you do this?" I had
Okay.
I had 4 children under the age of 5, and I said, "Gosh, I'm probably the most unemployable person you've ever met at this moment." And he said, "Well, we'll work with you. We'll figure out how to make it work." And they started by paying me at 12 hours a week, and I came in for a staff meeting. Eventually, they started helping find ways for me to have my childcare worked out. Anyway, they were very forward thinking in this regard. And so for 5 years, I served in that role, paid for part time work. And I saw firsthand how the ministry changes when not only does a leader have buy in because her work is being dignified with pay, but also because I was able to prioritize time for it in a way that I wouldn't have if I were a volunteer. And then, secondly, how the perspective of the church shifted toward women's ministry when it became something that was a formal part of the adult discipleship process.
Mhm.
So we look at these statistics and you have to ask why here we are almost, what is that? I can't do math. 20 years later.
Mhm.
Is that right? 30
Yeah.
years later.
Close. Yep.
Yikes.
25.
Time flies, guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, 25 years later, and still we're seeing that this is something that is not being thought of in equivalent terms to other ministry positions. And I do think that some of the reason that we still find ourselves here is because of what I've described earlier, that the pastor who is responsible for oversight for the area may not have very much of a sense of what is going on or much of a sense of what could be going on, how that
Mhm.
could be part of a larger strategy. I think that there's a tendency for male leaders to say, "Well, I don't understand what they're doing. I'll just let them do whatever."
Mhm.
That's too hands off. But then
Mhm.
there's another version of this that isn't great, and that's when they say, "Well, actually, I think I know better than they do how this should go." And then there's sort of an over management of what is a role that does need to be filled by a female, an embodied female. So I think then you combine that with most pastors have networks for filling roles on staff that they have developed through their time in seminary or other ministry environments. And those networks are almost entirely, if not entirely, male. And
Mhm.
so when there is room to develop a new position on staff, and they're thinking about who they can hire in terms of qualifications that they're already aware of or relationships that are pre existing, those are probably going to be with men. And so when personnel dollars do come available to hire for a role, it's understandable that that's where their attention goes. I say it's understandable, but I don't say
Mhm.
that it's ideal.
Mhm. Yeah. So you're saying it's basically a combination of they don't know the potential or value of a women's ministry because they haven't seen it for themselves.
Hmm.
And then secondly, their network for hiring as they envision how am I going to grow this church both maybe in depth and breadth. They're imagining other men, not necessarily other women.
Yeah. And a
Does
lot
that
of
kind of
times if
wrap
you
it
think
up?
about, let's talk about the youth minister position sort of as a comparable.
Okay.
It's like it's a niche ministry. It typically serves a smaller number of people than a women's ministry position would, but obviously we're talking about developing children into adults, and so I can understand why you would hire a student minister before you might think about hiring a women's ministry director. But the way that we think about a student minister is markedly different than the way that we would think about a women's ministry director, because a lot of times the student minister role is seen as a developmental role, right? Like that's a stopping point typically for a guy who will become a pastor at some point. The women's ministry role in a theologically conservative space is a dead end job. If
Mhm.
you're thinking about roles in terms of being a stop on a developmental highway, now,
Mhm.
it doesn't necessarily have to be a dead end job. There might be another role that a woman in that role could move into after she steps out of that one. But a lot of times, pastors, when they look at a role and think, well, this person can't become a pastor, therefore, I don't know how I would
Mhm.
even develop someone in that role. They can lack
Mhm.
imagination around the usefulness of the role because, from their perspective, as someone who is a pastor, this is not a role that is leading to that. So, therefore,
Mhm.
and I think sometimes there's even a sense of like, well, who would even really want that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that pay, and you mentioned this, and the research points to it as well, is part of the conversation, and it's a big part of it. But attached to that is just involvement in staff and being
Yeah.
in staff meetings and
Mhm.
strategic meetings.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that? Are women at those tables? Why or why not? And why do we want them at those tables?
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think in some cases they are, but it sounds like, according to the research that was done, and I would say just anecdotally what I hear from women, that is not usually the case.
Yeah.
um, that it's a very lonely way to do ministry because
Mhm.
you do feel like you're operating kind of off to the side on your own. And anytime that you're operating on your own off to the side, you're faced with this challenge of thinking, well, I mean, I'm sort of not on anybody's radar. Therefore, I do have a lot of ability to craft this exactly the way that I think that it should work. But the flip side of that is you're open to a great deal of liability if what you're doing comes
Mm.
under scrutiny, because
Mm.
doing that it turns out someone who is in a position of authority doesn't like, then it's going to, the narrative can arise that you have built an ivory tower ministry over to the side, when in fact
Yeah.
what you may have done is just been operating in a vacuum because there was not any direct communication from leadership toward you. What I find from the women that I talk to is that they would love to be a part of those
Mhm.
meetings. They would love to be a part of a holistic discipleship strategy in which they're seen as specialists who also have a lot of general access to the spiritual formation of the women that they're serving. Um, and instead, they're often seen as sort of a nice but not necessary
Mhm.
addition to church life. And because
Mhm.
their contributions are viewed as nice but not necessary, they are resourced as such and they're funded as such.
Mhm. So, one question that I frequently hear from pastors, especially who are sort of wrestling with what we're talking about, is this: why should we pay a woman to run women's ministry if we're not paying a man to specifically run men's ministry?
Well, I don't want to say that you shouldn't have a man running men's ministry, but I do think that if we look at this in terms of the paradigm of the church as the family of God, it is worth pastors asking the question, okay, do I have both visible male and female role models who the generation that's coming along behind can look to? In other words, we know that we want to act as brothers and sisters within the family of God, but in a healthy, functioning family, we have church fathers and we have church mothers. And so,
Mhm.
one of the key roles that a women's ministry leader can fill that is more than likely not already represented in some form on your staff is that
Mhm.
of a church mother. She can be someone who can have input into more than just a women's ministry space. She can be a help to a pastor in terms of dealing with issues of care, because
Mhm.
it's in those single gender spaces, in those all female spaces, that most, if not all, disclosures of abuse are going to come out. And so you want to have that person there as an ally to help that woman get the help that she needs, as an advocate to stand beside a woman as she walks through whatever process she needs to receive care. But not only that, but when rooms are all male, then decision making tends to happen only along lines that are typical of male decision making, very straight line and logical. And which is not to say, please don't overhear what I'm saying. I don't believe that
Mhm.
women are illogical, but sociologically speaking, you can see that male and female decision making falls along certain lines. Women tend to be more collaborative and
Mm.
consensus seeking. They tend to look at relationships, whereas men tend to look at processes. And so neither form of decision making is bad,
Yeah.
but either form in isolation can lead to misses in the ministry that we're trying to do. And so a female women's ministry leader can be a beautiful addition, not just for the sake of the women to whom she will minister, but also
Mhm.
to the staff as a whole in terms of the input that she can give.
Yeah. Yeah, you and your colleagues on Knowing Faith, JT English and Kyle Worley, you guys have done such a great job over the last few years of helping us refocus this conversation regarding brothers and sisters and the
Hmm.
faith family. And that is something that has been so lost in
Hmm.
recent generations. And so I appreciate you pointing us back to that again and saying, we need mothers, sisters, brothers, fathers represented at the
Hmm.
table.
Hmm.
Representation matters. There are issues and angles that only certain parts of the family can see,
Hmm.
and things that members of the family can address with those who are
Hmm.
coming to the church as well. And so it is beneficial to the whole family to have different members
Hmm.
present in leadership roles that are paid and that are involved in staff and strategic meetings.
Well, and going back to your earlier question of why have a women's ministry, if you decide, well, I don't want to do that, I'm not doing that at my church, it is important for pastors to know that just your decision as a church to not have a women's ministry doesn't mean that the women in your church will not be participating in women's ministry. They will
Yes.
go participate in it at the church that is offering it. And
Hmm.
you will actually have, if you have very little idea what's going on in your own women's ministry, you will have zero idea what's going on in theirs. And so, as someone
Hmm.
who cares about guarding doctrine and making sure that the people who are in your care are receiving good teaching and good formative practices, if you decide to opt out of having women's ministry at your own church, just know that women who are looking for spiritual mothers don't stop looking for them just because they don't
Hmm.
see them in your church. They will go find them. They'll either go find them at another church or they'll go find them online. And the likelihood that the pastor will even know the names of the women that are influencing their women at that point is low, much less the kinds of influence that those women are having on the women in his own church.
I have absolutely seen that time and time again. You are
Hmm.
right. Women will go find what they need. We are
Hmm. Or
innovative
what they think
and
they need.
resourceful. Mhm.
Yeah, or what
Absolutely.
they
What they
think they
think they
need,
need.
which is,
Hmm.
not awesome either. I remember a
Right.
few years ago there were some prominent female voices who were deconstructing, and I mean that's going to
Yeah.
continue to happen. We'll continue to see that happening, and up until it got very public, and then they began to be on the radar of men in leadership. They had a huge influence over women in my church, in your church,
Yeah.
I would imagine,
Hmm. For
and
sure.
yet the men who were responsible for the oversight of the women in their own churches wouldn't have even known the names of these women
Mhm.
until things were to a point where it was obvious
Yeah.
that the train had left the tracks.
Something closely related that I would love to ask you about, and it's something that I feel like maybe after that first question that I asked you about, why have a specific women's ministry leader if you don't have a specific men's ministry leader, probably the second most common reaction I have heard in these conversations is, well, we tried that, or I saw another church try that, and the women's ministry went rogue. And it was like there was this whole church alongside the church, but these women were not integrated into the church. And, I know how I've responded to it, maybe not the best, but Jen, what would you say to that particular question?
Well, I would say that if you tried to start a ministry and it didn't become a part of your broader strategy, that's actually on you for
Mhm.
not vetting and getting the right leader in place. Or not having enough oversight over what was happening to ensure that the ministry was a success. And I don't think it's fair to characterize women's ministry in particular as having a
Mhm.
tendency to go rogue. I think if we do that, then we've said something fundamental about women that I really
Mhm.
don't like. and
Yeah.
that I don't believe is true. I don't believe that women come to church to try to take things that aren't theirs. I believe that
Mhm.
they come to church and they see a need and they rush to fill it. They
Mhm.
would love to have oversight and direction, but in its absence, they will still organize and do the thing that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Which is why I think we see so many women who are willing to serve in a volunteer capacity with no thought for compensation, which, praise God, we need the church to not be built on people who are looking to be compensated. That's not the question in view here. The question
Mhm.
is, are there inequities that exist between the way that we compensate one role and another in a church that has the ability to pay someone in the women's ministry role?
Mhm.
So, I I would say that one of the reasons that a wrong leader gets put in place when there is an opportunity to start the women's ministry or to build a women's ministry is again related to the relational piece. There is a lot of relational capital already built between a pastor and other male leaders. And so the likelihood that he's going to choose the right male is higher than the likelihood that he's going to choose the most qualified female. In the case of a lot of women who I see get put into those roles when a church is in a hurry to build a ministry, it's, oh, well, so and so said she's great.
Yeah.
And there's not the same homework is not done to
Yeah.
determine whether it really is the best person. And we all know, anyone who has led in ministry knows, it is much harder to remove a wrong choice than it is to get a right choice in place. But it takes longer to hire the right person than it does to just fill a role. And
Mhm.
so, if there's more vigilance up front and if trust is built before the role is established and the ministry is crafted, then the likelihood of success for the ministry goes up as it does in any other ministry area.
Yeah. Yeah. We, having been church planters ourselves more than once, I know how exhausting it is for elders who are just starting out and are trying to create a body of believers, from
Mhm.
nothing. And so I
Mhm.
know there's that feeling of being overwhelmed, and women's ministry can quickly be sort of bumped to the back burner or seen as, I mean, this isn't very, benefit of the doubt, but even as a nuisance, or like, oh, I can't possibly work on that now. I've got to get the children's ministry and the youth ministry and the tithing and all
Mhm.
these things going underway. But what you said, that women really want to be invited to the table and are an asset in that situation.
Mhm.
I think, recognizing I'm a brother who needs my sister at the table. I'm a
Mhm.
mother who needs a father at the table, and vice versa.
Mhm.
Then you can grow something really constructive and helpful and biblical and good and nourishing for the whole body if you set out to do it. And
Right.
that is definitely better than to have it be an afterthought.
Well, and I mean, it's not like nobody's doing it well. Like we should have the same level of curiosity and exploration that we would have if we were building a family ministry. You don't
Mm,
just sit down and pull out a white sheet of paper and sort of start dreaming about how you want your family ministry to run. You contact the church that's done it really well for a really long time and you say, "What are your best practices?"
I love
Also,
that.
do you know anyone who might be a person who'd be suitable for this role at my
Hmm.
church?
I
And
love
so
that.
when we think about women's ministry, there are churches that have done women's ministry well for eons. And they would love, I trust me,
Hmm.
they would love to tell you how they did it. They would love to hand you
Hmm.
the playbook because it's not anything new. It's all
Hmm.
established best practices that can work either with a full volunteer team if your church is not big enough or far enough down the line to employ someone, or with someone who is a bought in paid staff member.
Yeah. Jen, one thing I hear often is that having a woman on staff will be awkward or lead to inappropriate contexts. Um, how do you respond to that? Or how do you make that not true?
Yeah, that's always a funny question for me to hear. Some of that's just based on my own experience of being a woman on staff because it's like, well, what kind of meetings are you picturing having with the men? Like, are you guys going to have slumber parties every week? Like the sheer number of spaces in which you can have the same kind of meeting with either a male or a female who is either on your staff or just in your downline in a volunteer capacity is staggering. The sheer
Yeah.
number of places where no one would bat an eye for the two of you to sit down and have a meeting far outnumbers any potential scandalous locations that the two of you might accidentally find yourself in because I don't know. I think there's a lot of heightened fear about managing risk that typically the woman who wants to find her way into the role and build the ministry, she is not thinking about that at all. She's just like,
Mhm.
just give me what I need to build the ministry. And so I think assuming a different thing about each other, coming toward the beginning of those relationships out of trust instead of out of fear, which is the way that a brother sister relationship would be shaped. And then
Yes.
allowing trust to develop along the lines that it does in any relationship. And I mean, I think I would just add to that that we are in a day and age where to say that it's safer to have a meeting with someone of the same sex because there won't be any kind of attractional element there, we just we cannot say that.
Mhm.
And so, if we're going to draw boundaries around meeting alone with people because of sexual risk, then really,
Mhm.
to be faithful, we should do it for both those who are the same sex and those who are opposite sex. So, and
Yeah.
actually, that would solve a lot of issues.
Yeah.
Just level the field and say, I'm only going to meet with human beings in my office. Male
Yes.
or female in my office, and then there you've solved your problem.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. That's really good. Well, Jen, how would you recommend a woman's ministry leader who isn't getting paid or who isn't invited into staff meetings or strategic planning meetings or isn't invested in those ways? How might she start those conversations? And I guess I want to caveat it by saying when I have these conversations with other women in ministry, and I know the same is true for you, they
Hmm.
love their elders. They love their
Yeah.
churches. They love
Hmm.
serving sacrificially.
Hmm.
I can honestly say, as many of these conversations as I've had, I've never had one with a woman who was really angry and out to get her leaders.
Hmm. Hmm.
She's always been one to quickly say, I love my pastors. I love my church. I don't want to speak
Hmm.
ill of them, but I am tired or I don't have the space to
Mhm,
keep serving like this at
mhm,
this capacity if I can't get paid. My kids are going to college. I need to get a job, these sorts of things. So,
mhm.
how do you advise her, Jen?
So the first thing I would say would be to pray. And I know that
Mm,
that sounds like the most Christian easy answer ever, but I mean it. Like, pray and make sure that your heart is in a good place with it. Check your motives. Is this more about you feeling that your work is dignified, or is it more about being able to better represent the women in the church who won't ever
mm,
sit in a meeting that you're going to be in? And
mhm,
it's not that it would be wholly one or the other, but it is important to sit down and assess where you are at the moment that you're ready to maybe raise your hand and say, "Hey, I have a question to pose." And then I would say that the first step would probably be just to invite. It would be to invite whoever the leader is that's over the area to come and see what it is that you're doing, to offer to set up a
mm,
meeting, to talk through what you are doing, and to invite input into that. To say, hey, I actually would really benefit from having a regularly scheduled meeting with you. Would that be okay with you? Can I set that up? Maybe it's quarterly or maybe it's once a month, depending on the scope of the ministry or how developed the ministry is. I think another thing that is good to do is to tell the stories of what is happening in the ministry. So it may be in a larger church that you send out a survey. I would say you should do this anyway, but send out surveys, to the women who are doing your Bible study and say, how did you grow this year, or what was, collect the stories, keep the stories,
mm,
repeat the stories to the people who can help develop buy-in into your ministry. They're hearing stories about other areas of ministry, but sometimes we forget that the stories in our area are every bit as beautiful and every bit as needful for the church to be hearing and, and,
mm,
and being blessed by. So tell the stories of the ministry, and like you said, Jen, because really it can't be said enough, there are no villains in this story. I
mhm,
mean, I totally agree with you. I can't think back to one leader who I've served with who I would say he just really wanted women to be invisible in the church. They don't know what they don't know, or they're just super busy because ministry is hard and there are a lot of things pulling on them. And so
mhm.
always, always, always give the person that you're talking to the benefit of the doubt. Um, and take time to build trust with that person,
Mhm.
to allow that person to not have to take a risk on you when it's time for them to maybe make a decision about whether they want to pay you or not, because you've demonstrated to them that you are a high level contributor and that if they were to pay you, it would be worth it to the church as a long term
Mm.
investment in the ministry.
Do you think there comes a time where that woman needs to bow out? Like if she has
Hmm.
persisted in this conversation
Hmm.
and it's not netting any kind of remarkable change for her or for her church, do you give this up or is it something that's so important you keep going?
Well, of course, that's highly situational. I do think that we have to keep taking the temperature of how it's impacting us personally.
Mm,
Is it causing me to be frustrated all the time, or is it still life giving? Is it something that I can
yeah.
still earnestly say I'm pouring into, and it's my mission. It's my mission to keep
Mhm.
carrying forward. And then I think it is worth asking, are the ways that we're investing in the ministry to women ways that are substantive? Are they ways that are
Mhm.
actually forming women into the image of Christ more than meeting felt needs? I do think that because, as I said, women tend to be more collaborative and consensus seeking in our decision making style, that we can sometimes be too deferential to the felt needs of the women in our church and less in a space of just leading and saying, no, I know this is what you want, but this is what you need,
Mm,
and giving
mhm.
them, that what's the centerpiece of the ministry going to be. I'm
Yeah,
biased. I would say the centerpiece should be Bible study that is
for
actually
sure.
Bible study, and then allow
Mhm.
the other things to sort of adorn that ministry,
Yeah.
but not drive the ministry. So I do think it's important to keep asking yourself, are
Mhm.
we doing something that is meaningful in the life of the church? Am I still invested in it? But there can come a time where,
Mm.
if there still is no buy in from those in leadership, and you can feel yourself burning out, that it's actually not just better for you, but it's better for the church for you to step
Yeah.
out of the role,
Mm.
that they have to feel the loss of your presence
Mhm.
there to understand the need. And I honestly think that that's kind of how I ended up.
Mhm.
Landing in that first job that I got all those years ago, to bring this conversation full circle. I know that the woman who stepped down would have loved to have kept leading, but if she had stayed in the role and continued to serve under resourced and sort of off to the side, then I don't think that the ministry could have developed into what it needed to be. So she made a sacrifice that ended up being beneficial for the church long term. I know it
Yeah.
was a hard decision for her, but I also think that in hindsight, she was able to look back and say that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard word, but I have seen that play out before, where a woman did go ahead and step down to preserve her own situation, not being burnt out, but also that the church would feel the
Yes.
loss of
Yeah.
that meaningful ministry, and then significant changes were made.
Hmm.
But that's a hard valley to walk through. Um, what about those of us, Jen? You and I are so fortunate and grateful to be in situations at the moment, where we are valued, we do have a seat at the
Hmm.
table,
Hmm.
we are paid, or I know that you recently stepped down, but
Mhm. But I
voluntarily.
chose to, and it
You
wasn't because
chose
I was
to.
burned out, just for the record.
Yes, yes, just for the record, thanks for adding that. um, how can we help our sisters, because sometimes I feel like I might be making her more frustrated. How can I be a
Mhm.
constructive helper to other women who
Yeah.
aren't in a situation like this?
Well, I do think it's been so important to me to remind myself, and I've tried to remind other women as well, that God cares more about ministry to women than I ever will, and He
Mm,
loves the women in our churches more than we could imagine.
yeah.
And so, even though I, in my 5 or 10 minutes of this life that I'll have to influence this particular thing, may feel like I haven't been able to make any incremental gains, or like I myself, have been overlooked, or maybe just not invested in the way that I see other leaders invested in. That it's important to sit down and number the things that you have been able to impact.
Mm,
Write them down. Write them
mhm,
down, and not to make much of yourself, but so that you can properly thank the Lord for what He
yeah.
is doing. And I do think, we can get so mired down in the perceived losses that we forget to express gratitude to God for what has already happened, and to
Mhm,
share the good things that have happened with each other, to build each other up. And I think it's important to have networks. I think you need to be talking to other women who are doing the same kind of work. And this is one of the most joyful aspects, I think, of doing women's ministry is those relationships for me have been absolutely life-giving.
Mhm.
Sometimes you do have to borrow courage from another leader or strength from another leader. Sometimes you're the one who's loaning it. But
Mhm.
between us all, we have a sisterhood or we have a network of mothers that is eager and willing to see the family of God thrive by having both male and female influences to shape our understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God.
Mm. I agree. Those partnerships and friendships are the dearest to me, and we do
Hmm.
give and borrow courage as the Lord allows. Okay,
Hmm.
one more specific question, and then I'm going to ask you to close us out in a specific way. But my question for you is this: should women continue pursuing theological training, especially something like seminary, which is very costly,
Hmm.
if it is very possible they will not be paid for their work when they're
Hmm.
done?
So, before I answer that question, full disclosure that I do not have formal theological training. I don't say that to recommend that path. I worked really hard to try to get what training I needed to not mishandle the scriptures. To have a sense
Mhm.
of how to handle the responsibilities that did come my way without error or
Yeah.
in a haphazard way. So, that being said, I would say that a seminary degree, if you have the flexibility to get one, um, is always going to be a gift, just from a human flourishing standpoint. I very much want there to be a lot of women who are theologically trained, whether that is because they are self motivated to get there by hook or by crook, or whether
Mhm.
they are able to have access to seminary training. But
Yeah.
if you are looking to receive a payback on that in terms of being in vocational ministry, then I would say think hard about that.
Mhm.
There are always only going to be a limited number of roles for women in the local church. It does require a church of a certain size to have the sense to look around and say, where are the women that I should employ? So if you are looking to have employment in a church based on your theological training, it means you're consigning yourself to always work in a church of a certain size. So
Mhm.
unless you feel drawn to do ministry in a big church, then I would think about that. But if you just want to teach the Bible and you want to do it really well, or if you want to be a thinker who thinks really well about these things, and maybe you want to write things for your local church, or it's for, being a mom or a wife. I mean, all of these things, or just being a good coworker. Like I said, from a human flourishing standpoint, you can't beat it. Honestly, you should be able to get that kind of training in your local church, but many of
Mhm.
us can't. And so you might be the person who becomes the conduit by which that kind of training finds its way into your local church. So as long
Yeah.
as you don't need to get paid to do it, I say
Mhm.
knock yourself out.
Sure. Yeah. And just for the listener, I'm going to link a number of resources in the show notes because there is so much out there. Lifeway, the Gospel Coalition, Simeon's Trust.
Mhm.
There's a lot of
Mhm.
ways for us to get educated, either for free or really
Mhm.
cheaply.
Yes.
And you've done that, and you've pursued, tough, really difficult learning and a great education. And as we've said multiple times, women are creative and innovative, and we will go get what we need, and it doesn't
Mhm.
have to be through seminary. Well, this has been such a helpful conversation, Jen. I could probably talk about it for several more hours, but I won't do that to you or our listeners. I would love for you to close us out with just some gospel hope when it comes to this. You just said a minute ago, we can get
Mhm.
mired down in the
Mhm.
discouragement, but there is so
Mhm.
much that is praiseworthy. So, could you
Mhm.
close us with just some encouragement and good news?
Mhm. Yeah, the Lord builds his church.
Mm,
He does it through us.
mm,
Praise God, which is really amazing and kind of seems like a bad idea to me, but since it's his idea, it must be able to work. And so I do think that if you find yourself feeling like the weight is on your shoulders and it's all up to you, that something is off. We can
mm,
remind ourselves, no, the Lord is doing this work, and I just need to look for how I can partner in that work. I think for many of us, it will always be in a volunteer capacity. I think for some of us, it can and should be in a paid capacity. I think for some of us, it will be outside of the local church. I think there's a reason, not a very happy reason, that we see so many women leading parachurch organizations. But that is not to say that parachurch work is of less value than church work. It's just a different place to serve. So
Mhm.
if you find that doors are closed to you in your local church and you occasionally doing some of these things, then by all means look around and see what work you might do in a parachurch space.
Mm.
But again, it's not all on your shoulders. And the
Yeah.
Lord does not give gifts to women that are just nice. He gives gifts to women that are essential and indispensable. And that means that there will be a place for you to use those gifts. It's just a matter of where and when and how.
Yeah. That's a great word to end on. Jen, thank you for your time. Thank you for the way that you serve the church and serve women. We are really grateful for you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Jen.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to All Things, where we look at current events and cultural trends through a Christian lens. All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus, so we're seeking to apply his word to what's happening here and now.